You're about to lose your accredited investor status. The SEC just released its Accredited Investor Report, and honestly, I feel like they've been watching my content for the last 18 months. The report is peppered with statistics showing how the accredited investor limits would be $3 million if it were actually adjusted for inflation, how IRA monies may be artificially inflating people's net worth, and also some of the recommendations that the subcommittee members actually have been making as to how they should proceed with updating the accredited investor definition. This all highlights the main problem for the SEC, which is 99.7% of all deals involve accredited investor, which means it only leaves them with 0.3% of people that they actually can help via their regulations. So ultimately what they're trying to do is to increase that non-accredited pool or decrease the accredited pool so that their regulations can have a far more reaching effect. So in this video, we're going to talk about the 3 biggest takeaways that I got from the SEC Accredited Investor Report. The first one is that they focused heavily on the difference between how many people were accredited back in 1982 versus how many people are accredited today. And they threw out a bunch of statistics, but I thought was interesting is they came up with the same analysis I've kind of been talking about over the last 18 months, which is like, hey, if you just take the $1 million net worth limits in 1982, if you adjust that for inflation using CPI, you're at $3,037,840. So that's something that they've explained that, hey, we haven't been adjusting it for inflation. And so if you just take 1982 numbers, you're at basically just over 3 million. They then focused a lot on, and they had a lot of stats, and they acknowledged the stats weren't exactly perfect, but they went through and said, look, in 1983, the year after it started, 1.8% of households were accredited. And they only have statistics for households. So technically you could argue individuals might be a little bit more. So they only have data available for households. So this is all based on households. But in 1983, the first year was implemented, only 1.8% of households were accredited. And then they jumped to 1989, and that number jumps to 3% of households were accredited. And today, or at least last year in 2022, that number went up to 18.5%. So since this has come out, we started with only 1.8% of households were accredited to today, it's 18.5. And what I thought was interesting, which again, kind of, I think gives you a little window of what they're thinking, they then projected it out. So they said, if this continues in 2032, there'll be 31.4% of households will be accredited. In 2042, it'll be 49%. And in 2052, 66% of households will be accredited. So this is obviously something that's on their radar, and they understand that this is not a trend that can continue. They want to update the definition, and it sounds like this is one of the things they're going to be looking at, which is the adjusted for inflation's numbers. Some people are arguing that it should just be adjusted moving forward. So just start today with $1 million, tomorrow $1,050,000, then the next year $1,001,000. Honestly, with all the statistics, I do think they're going to go back and make some kind of an adjustment based on inflation going back. So that was the first thing that I thought was super interested. By the way, on the net worth, somebody always asked me, have you heard anything about income, right? If the income number is going to go up. And they did go through the numbers on what the income was, $200,000 adjusted for inflation. That was $607,000 today for a single person, and about $911,000 for couples. So I can't see a world where they're going to jack the numbers up that big. Because I mean, if you're in the $600,000 range, you are top 0.5% or 0.3% of income. So that seems a little high. But again, that's something I thought was interesting. The second thing I thought was interesting is that they focused a lot on IRAs, which came out of the blues for me. So they focused a ton on IRA, meaning back in 1982, when this thing started, a very small percentage of retirement funds were in IRAs. I guess back then, a lot of it was sort of the pensions and defined contributions as opposed to what it is today. And again, they threw out a bunch of statistics where today, 34% of people's retirement accounts are in IRAs versus back in 1982, that number was 2.5%. So a huge increase in the amount of people's retirement accounts in IRAs. They did the calculation as to, hey, if we eliminated the IRA money as an asset, if we stopped counting IRA money as an asset, then the accredited investor pool will shrink from about 12.5% to be exact today to 8.8%, which I actually had never thought about, but that's definitely one thing they're looking at. It might be something they incorporate in addition to or in lieu of the increasing the dollar amount, just looking at the IRA money and just not using that as the calculations. And then the last thing that I thought was interesting is that they do go towards the end, they go to a bunch of suggestions. Like a lot of commentators like myself, I'm considered a commentator. You guys, anybody who's in the market can always write to the SEC and say what your thoughts are on what you want to do. And so they went through a bunch of those, but the ones I thought was interesting was there's actually a couple of subcommittees of the SEC, which are the Small Business Advisory Committee. They came out in 2019 saying that they should leave the definition the same, but maybe just adjust it for inflation moving forward. That was one of the recommendations. And also one of the recommendations was, hey, maybe we do eliminate the IRA money. We don't count the IRA money because that's going to shrink. There's other people that wanted to suggest other things. And it's literally a combination. At the end of the day, it was a combination between adjusting for inflation starting in 1982 to today, adjusting for inflation only moving forward, adjusting both, meaning adjusting it from 1982 and then moving forward, adjusting it, taking the IRA money. And then the other thing that I thought was interesting, which actually makes a ton of sense, was one of the SEC, this is what I was looking for, one of the SEC subcommittees also suggested that maybe the accredited investor thresholds change by geography. Right? Because obviously, if you make $200,000 in California versus making $200,000 in Nebraska, that is a huge difference. And if you figure out what percentage in relation to everybody else in the state you are. So that's another thing they're looking at, of maybe tweaking it, or at least some of the recommendations have come on is tweaking it based on geography. And there's other factors they throw in, just, underrepresented minorities, and there's a bunch of other things. But I thought those were the interesting ones. So I guess I need to think of it in my own content in terms of, is it just going to be an adjustment based on income and net worth? Or maybe they do figure out, hey, maybe they pull the lever of IRA, or maybe they pull the lever on geographic location, which is something that one actually makes a ton of sense to me. But at the end of the day, here's the issue that they're facing. They came out with a bunch of statistics. If you guys are statistic geeks like I am sometimes, they've got a bunch of tables, how many offerings, have been made over the last 20 years, or how many offerings were done last year, how many accredited investors, what's the total amount of raises. I mean, all these statistics are there. But at the end of the day, the one that stuck out the most was from 2009 till today, or till 2022, there's been about 10 million investors that have invested in Reg D offerings. 99.7% of them are accredited or have been accredited. Now, I know in our world, we deal with a lot of non-accrediteds. Even in our practice, I would say probably 70% are still non-accredited investors and 30% is accrediteds only. But if you look at the broader market, the bigger market, the vast majority, 99% plus of investors are accredited, which means when they come out with these regulations to protect the little guy, to protect the person who's not accredited, it's a really small percentage of people that they are actually now affecting, right? And again, if you go back to 1982, that number was much bigger. They wrote these rules to protect those, theoretically, the little gal who can't fend for themselves. And so that's, I think, the reason why all this stuff is coming out. They want to increase the amount of people that they have the ability to reach and protect, because right now we're looking at 0.3%. So if you enjoyed this clip and you want to see the entire episode, click here. And if you want to see other videos similar to this, click here.